So my name is Olivia. Woo! Hi. What do we do in raves to get attention? Okay, cool. We clap. Hi everyone. My name is Olivia. I work for Or Books. Or Books is the publisher of Writing on Raving, the wonderful book that we are celebrating the launch of tonight. Or is a small publishing house. We're located in the back of this great bar, the Francis Kite Club. Yeah, let me move out of your way, so you guys. And we do a series of events around the books that we publish, like tonight, tomorrow night, if you are feeling hungry and want to come back. We're doing a book launch for another book called I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It by Norman Finkelstein. Check out our website for other titles that we publish. We're a lefty, radical alternative publishing house, and we hope that you'll find some books that will be of interest to you, along with our event schedule that will be going throughout the summer. But for now, I'll introduce two of the co-editors of this book, Geoffrey Mack and Zoe Beery. Unfortunately, Mackenzie Work couldn't be here tonight. And then we have Katie Way from Hellgate, who will be helping moderate this conversation, and Destiny B, who is one of the contributors and will also be reading from one of their contributions. And afterwards, we'll be actually playing some music from a playlist that one of the contributors of the book also made. So I'll turn it over to you all. Thank you.
Katie, do you want to explain what Hellgate is?
Oh yeah, sure. Okay, so before we get into the readings, panel, etc., I have to plug my worker-owned news publication. So Hellgate is worker-owned, subscriber-funded. Maybe I don't have to hold this. No, you're good. Okay, sweet. So yeah, Hellgate is a worker-owned, subscriber-funded local news and culture publication. We cover New York City primarily, and we are happy to be co-hosting this event with Writing on Raving. You know, if it is happening in New York, if there's a weird thing on your block, if your politician tweeted something fucked up, we want to know about it, and we write about it. So we're selling merch at the front and also hawking subscriptions, as always. And yeah, check us out, hellgatenyc.com. Thanks.
Okay, so we're going to start with readings. So I was trying to decide what to read that I have not. Oh, hello. Is it? Okay. This is a really old essay. It's actually the first personal essay I've ever published. Also the first rave thing I wrote, I think. And so I was going back looking at it, and I'm like, I think I'm going to read this one. It's called Pleasures of the Highest Sense. After Ben and I got back from the party at around 10 in the morning, I lay awake in bed, still coming down from MDMA, and thought about my grandmother for the first time in a while. There was no clear reason why she should have been on my mind, except that it was hot, dry hot, the way it was in LA the summer before she died. I thought of her as she was during the later years of her life, sitting in her red wheelchair, impeccably dressed, with her hair done up like Queen Elizabeth. This was a woman who understood that respect was a matter of character as well as aesthetic. Often, she'd wear dark colors like rock candy or the Pacific Ocean, colors that could take her far from her house in Covina, where she lived with her 3 daughters after the whole family immigrated here in the 70s. I rarely ever saw her outside that house with its 4 empty beds, where my aunt and my mother used to sleep before they married and moved away. They tell me they spent their lives afraid of her, as she was caustic and difficult and had the tendency to deliver terrifying judgments of one's character that were brisk and decisive. Yet when I was a child, she was the woman who sang to my siblings and me stories about secret dynasties on the moon and made us egg tarts and shrimp chips before kneading the dough eventually came too hard on her hands. In the months before she died, I was living at my parents' house, where I slept at 10, I reread James Joyce, and swam regularly in the backyard pool as the fire swept the hills that summer and every summer since. On the weekends, we saw the Chinese gardens at the Huntington Library and had lunch in the clubhouse with caviar and tea steeped in rose petals. We couldn't talk much when we ate, and toward the end of summer, my mother began packing her meals in Tupperware to spend the night with my aunt and my grandmother in the house in Covina. Toward the end, sitting up became too difficult for her, and she couldn't leave her bed. She drank mashed up vegetables from a straw, and whenever she needed to piss, my aunt and mother had to hoist her onto a yellow bucket beside her bed. When my father and I visited, I sometimes brought my cello and played the Bach suites until the sound became too hard on her ears. Mostly we just sat there and waited as she, well, what else, woke up, ate, and then fell back asleep. One afternoon, my mother sat beside her bed during the sort of 10-minute slots we took turns rotating. When he asked her how he could pray for her, she looked at him and said, "I want to die." This was on my mind still by the time Ben and I got to Berghain some 6 hours later. At the time, the club became for me what the Paris Opera had been for Proust. It hosted a ritualized gathering of the veterans of a globalized underground as Byzantine as Hollywood or New York publishing, and the kids of Europe's demi-monde, who were too interesting for what their futures had to offer. A typical Sunday produced a reliable cast of types: porn stars, drug dealers, PhD candidates, and Turkish exiles. In the summer when the garden opened up, you'd see, for instance, a gummy fetishist walk in with a Balenciaga model, or a drag queen in stripper heels with a dancer from the Stotts Ballet. That Sunday, by the time Ben and I arrived, the main hall of the club was full, dark because it had no windows, and humid because of military-grade fog machine and other people's sweat. At the entrance by the stairs stood a massive white statue of Dionysus, a stand-in for bodily hedonism and dialectic with the technological severity of the club's mechanistic aesthetic, itself a disused power plant in neoclassical drag. Adam X was playing, opening with the usual 4/4 beat associated with techno, looped in perpetuity. The foreground of the set was textured and repetitive, which pushed to mind the focus on the subtle variations happening in the background, a drone or a barely perceivable hi-hat. In fact, during the first 10 minutes of the set, I was under the impression that nothing was changing, a fairly typical experience when first acclimating to the sound. That the strictest of constraints can yield the most inaccessible of pleasures is by now a cliche familiar to BDSM practices as well as high modernist painting. The endurance it demands makes it even more so attractive, as if the severity of the challenge guaranteed a rarefied ecstasy by the effort alone. At Berghain, a closing set can run up to 15 hours, soliciting considerable human effort that outpaces even some of the durational compositions by minimalist and fluxus composers in the 1970s New York. Yet techno is also exponentially more popular, itself a multi-billion-dollar industry worldwide. To some of the most prominent techno DJs I know, a set that lasts for 1 hour is considered light. 2 hours is enough to work with, 4 hours is standard, and 8 to 14 merely a challenge, but curiously not unreasonable. It's perhaps by this logic that techno makes people lose their minds at the rave, in the sense that the phrase is also used to mean maniacal. Like any marathon sport, submitting to such terms requires an agreement not to run away from repetition, exhaustion, or boredom. It's a choice instead to immerse yourself into it. After spending upward of 20 hours in a single club, a combination of sustained sleep deprivation, drugs, and exhaustion from having not eaten contributes to a sophisticated delirium. As if in a meditative state, the conscious mind recedes. In the absence of conscious thought, the mind becomes vacant to receive the unknown. Here it is possible to fall into multiple states of consciousness at once, like sleepwalking through a lucid dream. Only after the repeated breakdown and exhaustion of one's restrictive faculties can the imagined life be permitted to flourish, completely uninhibited, at 10 in the morning of some basement or club or warehouse scheduled for demolition, beyond dehydrated, skin slicked smooth by the salt of your sweat, glancing around to see if anyone else witnessed what had just taken place. Admittedly, I didn't go to these raves looking to find the materiality of sound returned back to itself along a syncopated system. I wanted transcendence. Between the years of 2012 to 2018, I traveled the world looking for raves the way some surfers chase waves. Midnight in Hong Kong, Unter in New York, Concrete in Paris, or Berghain in Berlin. I started running into the same people in different cities around the world, not unlike the tour schedules of DJs I saw most those years. To most of my friends, it became a curious eccentricity of mine, one which I felt reluctant to explain, which is to say it was personal. Over time, techno came to embody both the ladder to the divine as well as a sanctuary from it, a split aesthetic I came to associate with modernism, which mirrored the later years of my 20s when my mind started to split into territories that were increasingly irreconcilable, another thing I'm reluctant to explain. As a writer who doesn't identify with the modernist project, I work in narratives. I am always looking for the beginning before the middle to see how it got to the end. I often wrote stories that were only about love insofar as they could detail its absence. Love itself I understood to be hostile to the story, to narrative itself. Because where the story is interested in moments of change, love is a constant. Love doesn't have a causal trajectory over a 3-act structure. Love, necessarily unconditional, superimposes itself onto objects that don't warrant it necessarily. Love exists and wants only to exist, depends on nothing for its existence, and repeats itself endlessly as though looped in perpetuity. During the summer before my grandmother died, I visited her weekly. Most of that time was spent sitting across from her as she slept, and because she had no teeth, her lips inflated and deflated like tarps. Toward the end, when her mind began to fail, she would tell me the same stories over and over again. I grew bored, restless, and impatient, and I'm ashamed of my boredom now that she is gone. In the chapel that held my grandmother's funeral, my family screamed. I remember when my aunt first saw the coffin. She reached for her sister and dug her nails into her shoulders. It was howling. It was the sound we made because we could not accept death. Though it wasn't death that made us love her more. Death is a violence that makes love visible where it previously had not been. I loved this woman all my life, but I would visit her maybe once or twice a year and would not think of her when I was gone. Such is the nature about love, that it is forgettable, it's boring, taken for granted, and made demonstrably true for all of these reasons. During the years I lived in Berlin, I spent hundreds of hours at Berghain listening to techno. Because it was boring, because it didn't change, it just repeated itself. All nights a variation of the same night, the night for me in August when Adam X was playing. I remember standing by the speakers as the bass grew harder, pounding at a relentless force and speed. There, I would think of every beat as the sound of a person who had been loved, a person no longer here, and it was precisely their absence that brought back their presence, and memories turned over in the mind, repeated in our thoughts to bring back those who are gone. All the people I have ever loved, I still love, and all the people I've ever lost are still with me. And I felt them there, standing in that great hall, while the music pounded on as if 1,000 pounds of steel and concrete were crashing down multiple levels, dismantling in midair and crushing to the floor, sliding, grinding, screeching across the pavement. And deep in the background, I could hear a blank drone that I could only decipher when standing next to the speakers, blank like the afternoon light that came into the window of my grandmother's bedroom. There were no photos on the wall, the calendar taken down to cover up the counting of days. So it was just the blankness of the eggshell white with the sharp summer light cutting diagonally across the surface. It was an LA summer, and there wasn't any breeze from the window. I was checking my watch to see how much time had passed, and it was never as much as I'd thought, and the fan was still going, and my grandmother was still sleeping in front of me, hands folded over her chest. And that to me now is what I think of when I think about love. Thanks.
I am reading the piece that is in the book, so now that you will hear it, you don't have to read it ever again, but you can. In the early months of 2018, my friend Jay and I developed a ritual. One Saturday a month, he'd show up on my stoop at 2 a.m., both of us bleary off our disco naps. We'd get in a car and go to a low-slung building in Bushwick whose facade looked like the outside of a saloon in a Western movie. Inside was a disused banquet hall fashioned into a simulacrum of Berlin. Black clothes, hard techno, lots of drugs. Neither of us had been to Berlin, but we understood it as a place where the rules were not quite so constricting and the music was really good. The ritual continued like so: buy a mate, take MDMA, and talk about anarchism. One night, we stood on a balcony overlooking the dance floor, watching the separate movements of 300 strangers cohere around Mary Yuzovskaya's hypnotic pounding. It was autonomy in motion, a collective experience created by individual choice and consideration of the whole. Jay turned to me, his pupils crowding out the whites of his eyes, and yelled, "This is it! This is the revolution!" It was the kind of proclamation that only happens when you're rolling, something that feels so pure and urgent that you have to shout it even though it's ridiculous. At that moment, the lights flashed to red, then off to black, the colors of the anarchist flag, and we didn't stop laughing for 5 minutes. I had been going to demos and actions since I was 12. Raving had only come to me in the previous year, and I was convinced that it was revolutionary. How else to explain my friendship with Jay? It started the year before it sustained release, when he wandered up to me and my friend S at the fire pit at 3 a.m. on Sunday morning, looking for someone to talk to about autonomous organizing. How else to explain that we kept making more friends at demos who turned out to be ravers and friends at raves who turned out to be leftists? I read about field raves in Britain in the early 1990s that in retrospect have been interpreted as revolts against Thatcherite austerity. I read about how Berghain started as an anarchist squat amid the rubble of the Berlin Wall. I went to raves that fundraised against ICE. I started a zine with S about the rave as liberation. At the demos we all went to, we heard the classic chant, "We are unstoppable, another world is possible." The one without prisons, borders, violent hierarchies. Possible, sure, but impossibly far away. And then we went to the rave together, and when it was a good night, we stepped into the other world. It usually appeared around 3 a.m., when the amateurs left, and ended whenever sunlight first pierced our field of vision. I call it the time between yesterday and tomorrow. Mackenzie Wart calls it the time where there is more time. Henri Lefebvre, I can't pronounce this guy's last name, Lefebvre? Somebody here has read this guy and can correct me, who I don't think ever went to a rave, but would probably have liked them, calls it appropriated time. The time we take back from the rhythms of capitalism and use for our own purposes. It is a time that forgets time, during which time no longer counts and is no longer counted. It arrives or emerges when an activity is in harmony with itself and with the world. It has several traits of self-creation or a gift, rather than an obligation or an imposition come from without. I found that moving with my friends in appropriated time strengthened our bonds in the streets. As we pulled up our bandanas and stared down the cops, we knew the vision we were fighting for because we had been there over the weekend. Solidarity and techno felt the same in our bodies, explosive, totalizing, exhilarating. In my first few years of raving, I would look around at the crowd and assume it was made up of radicals I just hadn't met yet, strangers who also heard liberation in the speakers. The anarchist and the raver both count police and real estate as enemies, and the need to destroy both seemed so intuitive to me that I could not imagine anyone at the party felt differently. I simply hadn't met enough of the people I was dancing with. One night, I made a friend on the dance floor and found out the next day that she worked at Palantir, and so did another guy I saw around all the time. Someone I recognized from the latest hours at the best parties turned out to work at a government office whose mandate was to bring raving under the purview of the state. I ran into one of New York's headline DJs during the 2020 uprising, one who had soundtracked many of my hours of appropriated time, and she told me that she had never read the news until that month. She was 37. The people around me on the dance floor were there to escape, like me, but they weren't doing much to change the conditions we were escaping from. There was nothing political about any of it. The last time I went to the party where Jay and I had first seen revolution on the dance floor, there were uniformed NYPD officers at the door. The promoters didn't want to get shut down, so they asked the cops for permission to throw a rave and agreed to their every demand. In the winter of 2021, a friend from Montreal, who showed up unannounced sometimes in New York at raves, other times at an autonomous organizing space in Ridgewood, posted a video of a renegade on some train tracks. It looked like the kind of thing we couldn't get away with in New York. I asked him where it was. Atlanta, he told me. Are you hooked into Stop Cop City? A year and a half earlier, on June 12, 2020, an Atlanta cop had shot and killed an unarmed black man named Rayshard Brooks in the parking lot of a Wendy's. George Floyd had been murdered less than 3 weeks before, and the next day, Atlantans burned the Wendy's to the ground. In the spring of 2021, the mayor of Atlanta announced her solution to police brutality, a $90 million training facility to be built on land in the unincorporated outskirts of the city that was currently a forest and had previously been a prison farm. Its marquee innovation was a mock town where the cops could practice putting down mass urban revolt. Another 2020 uprising would not be tolerated. Organizers in Atlanta dubbed the plan Cop City. By the time I saw my friend's video, a few dozen of these organizers had started a full-time encampment in the forest to physically stop Cop City from being built. The ravers in the movement, and there were many, insisted on throwing parties almost every month because their vision of a world without Cop City included having fun. Later, one of them told me that the forest was the only place left in Atlanta for raving because the same police that would train at Cop City had collaborated with the real estate industry to shut down warehouse parties in preparation for rezoning abandoned industrial parks into condos and upscale retail. As ravers, they understood the stakes of the movement, a future where raves and treves give us life, or one where police take both and kill us. The encampment survived the winter and then the spring. Environmentalists, school teachers, prison abolitionists, and artists joined the crust punks. From afar, it seemed to me that the Forest Defense was working because it operated like a good rave. A large group of people, many of them strangers, had converged to see what would happen when they tried to do something together, even if they had different reasons for being there and no particular outcome was guaranteed. In June, a call echoed across Signal group chats. Come to Atlanta for a week of action in July and see what it's like to live in the other world that's possible. 6 of us bought flights. There was Jay, of course, and Dee, who we'd met in the year at Nowadays. Our 3-person group chat was named after Mark Fisher. I'd met N because we simultaneously had the same idea during the 2020 uprising to collect earplugs from shuttered nightclubs and distribute them to street medics to guard against NYPD sound cannons. Her oldest friend, G, had partied in Berlin and joined an occupation against a coal mine in rural Germany. Our friend L, who N had met at a New Wave night in Chicago, was the only one who had been to Atlanta. These were the people I trusted with a trip across state lines to do the most militant thing I'd ever done, and I had met all of them through raving. The climate of summer in Atlanta reminded me of the unventilated back room of a chicken and pizza shop in Brooklyn that hosted raves before COVID. In both, oxygen was replaced by moisture. Otherwise, the forest was spectacular, light dappling through the pine trees, a creek running past our tents, salamanders in the underbrush, birds overhead. A sign nailed to a tree trunk marked the entrance to the encampment. You are now leaving the USA. We entered unending appropriated time, which we filled with walks, workshops, cooking, reading, and conversations with strangers about the years-long political journeys that had brought us to the forest. There was a rave on Saturday night to cap off the week of action. Glow sticks sketched a path on the forest floor toward a clearing sheltered by an enormous blue tarp. Other than all the camo, no one really looked like a raver. The speakers were blown out and blasting a UK garage edit of I Ain't Got You by Alicia Keys. As twilight fell, even more people showed up, teenagers and wooks and punks, punctuating the DJ sets with cries of Stop Cop City. It was not like any other rave I'd been to. It was a rave in the original sense, a renegade DIY free party that didn't seek to create a specific experience, but conjure an entirely new space. I realized that I had in fact never been to a rave, only varyingly expensive parties. Those parties were just rooms full of strangers unless the conditions were perfect. The music, the crowd, the lights, whatever drugs I was on, they all had to coalesce into transcendence. I needed the music in particular to hypnotize me away from the world outside. But in the forest, I needed none of it. I looked around at my friends, totally sober, these relationships that intertwined waving with a belief in the total transformation of the world. Here we were together, in the place we sought in Brooklyn at 5 a.m. but rarely found. And so it didn't really matter that the music was inconsistent, that the lights were bright, that people were twirling fiber optic whips off to the side of the dance floor. In the forest, we had appropriated not just time, but the world itself. And in this place, the other world that's possible, there was still a rave, but one of celebration rather than escape. Raves are a threat to the order of things, and so this state must crush them. But their threat is tiny, a night of rebellion that lasts for maybe 10 hours. The repression is small, too, a brief detainment, a fine, an impounded sound system. In the months after we visited the encampment, Stop Cop City grew into the most potent and entrenched threat the US government had seen in years. A small group of anarchists and racial justice activists had become the focal point of global leftist organizing. The narrative was ironclad. Why destroy a forest and replace it with cops? 4 months after the rave, once winter temperatures had shrunk the encampment, the police dragged 6 forest defenders out of their tree houses and charged them with domestic terrorism. 2 months after that, the police shot a forest defender named Tortuguita 52 times during a raid near the forest dance floor and charged 4 more people there with domestic terrorism. In March, the police raided a music festival near the forest during another week of action and charged 36 people there with domestic terrorism. There was supposed to be a rave that night, but it didn't happen. The next month, as I cried with Dee about all of it, they told me something they'd learned during a conversation in Atlanta. The founder of the Ridgewood organizing space, where our forest crew was spending increasing amounts of time, had been learning how to DJ before he was killed in a collision on the drive back from Standing Rock. He had apparently become convinced that transformational change would be possible only if it included parties. Jay had not been wrong on the balcony. It was not a coincidence that we had met at a For the Heads techno festival, or that the rave friends had led me to Atlanta, or that the Forest Encampment was founded partially by ravers, or that raves happened there all the time. We rave because it allows us to feel in our bodies a defiance of the lie that the world the cops impose on us is the only option. Raving is not a political act or a utopia, but it contains a seed of revolution if you give it some free water.
Hello. I was gonna read from the book, but I decided to actually just read. Well, I was gonna split it between a piece that's kind of like a sequel to the book that hasn't come out yet, but I think I'm just gonna read from the piece, and that acts as like a sequel to the piece that's in the book. Jeff actually has some intimacy with this because when he was helping me edit the piece that's in the book called "We Can All Live in This House," it was a spiraling piece of text, and Jeff said, "Here's where the text is. All this other stuff actually needs to just become something else altogether." And that piece is currently being edited, and I said the same thing last year, but this time I mean it. It's going up on Dweller by the end of June, so please look out for that. And so this one, the working title is "We Never Left the Discotheque." I was enjoying my time in the New York City underground, riding the waves of club, juke, jungle, and techno, but I couldn't really figure out how I found myself there. A few years before, I remember first attending Soul Summit. I read More Brilliant Than the Sun by Kodo Eshun. Disco and house music are mentioned a little, but barely make an appearance. Just by reading it, I wouldn't have gotten the impression that the genres were the precursor to the music that I reveled in. I had loved all the artists mentioned, like Sun Ra, Parliament, and Tricky, and it introduced me to techno's black origins like Drexia. But with all the music I was listening to, it didn't really clarify for me the evolution of music to get me to where I was. I listened to so much jazz and funk, and then when it came to techno, I silently wondered, how did I get here? Sonic intellectually, I understood the relationships between the genres, but I could tell I skipped some tracks. Detroit techno, capital letters, seemed like the obvious starting point for what was playing in the clubs and raves I was going to. But house was framed like a 90s derivative, pioneered mainly in Vogue scenes to eventually be co-opted, appropriated, and watered down by white DJs, forever lost to the Kiwis and the Aussies. I viewed disco as a naively cheerful genre of my parents' generation, a consumer's version of funk, that nostalgic white gays love to perfect their black female vocalist mannerisms for the next drag performance. I was so gravely misled and uninformed. In time, I've recognized techno to now be basking in its cultural redemption arc. The story of techno is a story like so many genres birthed from black creators. It traveled far and then was extracted and adopted by another people. And through enthusiasm, marketing, and maybe some malevolent insistence, the black impulses origins of our genre were decimated. Techno has had the incredible benefit of having a full circle moment in its glory today. Young black artists are reclaiming it, and its origin story is being retold and remembered anew. As with any black genre, black people never really left or really forgot, but the force of uptake was so thunderous and spectacular, the people could not be seen or heard. As the appropriation story is so old and tired, the people maneuver their captors by simply moving on or renaming things. Ragtime became jazz. Rock and roll became funk. Hip hop became drill and grime. Techno became juke, bass, club, etc. We can get persnickety about genre and oral and rhythmic distinctions, but really the names don't matter. What qualifies the argument is the evolution of the sound and abetting of instruments through time. Genre is not a fixed position. Names and titles only come with the clarity of hindsight, or they nestle themselves into the collective psyche through repetitive synapses that come after epiphonic descriptions and continuous usage. Adjectives and verbs, sometimes made-up words, become eponyms. The emergence of genre is a nebulous process of evolution and cross-pollination that withstands the projection of division onto an amorphous cluster of phenomena. In actuality, there are always gray areas, influence, and crossovers. In art and music, especially, there is no static position. It is a matrix of spectra, not the oft-cited linearly imagined spectrum, but a gaseous cloud of varying densities. And like a cloud, we can only differentiate the colors of the rainbow when light is projected onto it. That light is hindsight, or the observance of history. At the moment of emergence, creators are not so concerned with what to call their creations, nor are audiences interested in naming their experiences. At that moment, everyone is caught up in the ecstasy of arrival and the excitement of the uncharted. The birth, or rather the conception, is protected by a thick, potent darkness, the black origins of creation. That is not to say that boundaries or differentiation should not exist. Certainly, everything in creation deserves a name. And that is exactly what Juan Atkins did when he insisted on the name techno to Virgin Record label executives in 1988 for the Touchstone compilation album Techno! The New Dance Sound of Detroit, that defined the genre. However, the working title of the compilation was The House Sound of Detroit. Atkins christened the music invention with a name drawn from his own sonic philosophies and inspirations, lifted from the theorist Alvin Toffler's book, The Third Wave. Atkins had the admirable instinct to identify the distinction from house, but the name techno was entirely new and unfamiliar to audiences, which maybe was the reason the compilation album release was a bit of a flop. The title prevented the benefit of a subconscious recognition from a network of synapses and an organic name, like house. The title, maybe a bit too intentional, was a slight revision of history, or a preemptive revision of the future, meant to package the genre as an invention rather than presented as an evolution. That revision persists today. Techno is seen as an outlier, a random aberration of black music that restarted the clock in music evolution. But this just is not accurate. Techno lies in a lineage with clear sonic evolution and influences, just like all other genres. And specifically, it evolved from house. Techno's predecessor, house music, is a genre understood today as having specific tonal structure and rhythmic patterns. But at the conception of house in the late 70s and early 80s, there was no specific sound, lyrical designation, or polished producer effects called house. House named an impulse, a context, not a sound. The naming of house was a co-emergent process and came about through a swarm of reactions, explanations, and associations. No one can claim its authorship. For some, the origin is obvious. The name evolved from the club Warehouse in Chicago, where the genre was pioneered. Others argue that actually it had more to do with the creation of original tracks on drum machines or mixes on tape decks released by dance clubs and DJ collectives, produced in-house, if you will. Many more associate the name with the feeling and emotion of familiarity, being at home in the sanctuary of queer nightlife where elsewhere was hostile, like the houses of the ballroom scene. This is the impulse that led record label execs to initiate the project, this House Sound of Detroit. The new day begins tonight. Enter the new round. Enter the next phase. Enter the program. Technify your mind. Juan Atkins' lyrics on Cybertron's 1983 release, Enter, heralded the birth of the era. Techno's central focus is the future and realms beyond the human. Techno named a preoccupation with the technological era and its implications on structural and social paradigms. Techno hyper-realizes rhythm technology through advanced electric instruments as an inquest for new perceptions of selfhood in the post-human era. Although Atkins explicitly names science fiction, futurist theory, electronic music bands like Kraftwerk and funk music as its inspirations, taken at face value, such citations, they don't tell the whole story. To understand the conditions that propelled the query of techno, disco, and its daughter house must come into question. I'm gonna just read this last paragraph and that'll conclude the 10 minutes, and then it goes on much longer. House music rises from the ashes of disco, which is a quote, which will be explained later. It marks an evasion, a slippage, a feint, the moment when the people renamed disco and went underground. If disco became known for its lights, flamboyance, and commerciality, then house is the moment where pretension was shed to become something inconspicuous, a strategic pivot towards a protective and generative darkness, the creative unknown. House music is disco that is preoccupied with extended rhythm breaks looped from the classics, fed through technology, warped into something new. House centralizes, delays, repeats, and burrows into elements found in the breaks and the heavy bass drops. It is proudly tethered to disco because it extracts its sound from the archive, the people, and its history. Thank you.
All right, panel time, everyone. Cool, so thank you all for reading, that was cool. Thank you all. So just to kick things off, if everyone, I think it would be cool to hear about everyone's introduction to raving and maybe a little bit about if you have any memory of like the party that got you hooked or the moment you were like, this is my activity. That'd be cool.
I can go first because it came to mind immediately. I got into raving because when I moved to New York, my friend Sophie, who may or may not be here right now, Kevin, stop it. Was already into techno. She took me dancing, and we went to a party. This was before I'd really consider myself a raver. I was meeting my friend Jay at Sustained Release that I think really like pushed me into the rave hole. But Sophie took me to a party that was the 1 year anniversary, or the 1 year birthday party for Disc Woman. Everybody remember Disc Woman? And it was a collaboration with Unter, which is also the party referenced in my piece where they brought the cops in eventually. And we went in, and it was in a literal warehouse and industrial area of Bushwick, and there was Molly in the punch. And I was like, what? I've heard about this kind of a thing. I didn't know they did it. And it was a long night where I talked to strangers, and like the music was really like taking me, and it felt like what I had heard a rave was. And it's definitely not the best party I've ever been to, but I think it was the first time where I felt like I was at like a rave, and it was cool and fun.
Awesome.
I'll go next. So I moved to New York in 2009, and my first experiences, at the time, I feel like the term raving was kind of like passe. It's kind of come back. At the time, it was clubbing. So I was going, but it was also like, we couldn't really call it the club always because we would go to warehouse parties when like Morgan Ave and Jefferson Ave was like still like a lot of artist squats and lost and stuff. And so I was seeking the rave there without really knowing what I was seeking, but it really didn't hit the spot until I came across Ghetto Gothic, which their early parties were actually at this place called R Bar, I think, or Gallery Bar. It was like around here, and it was like in the basement, and it was actually tiny. And it was like a very experimental club set that was being played, and I like fell in love immediately. They had hired dancers also, which was like I feel like a thing that clubs used to do, or like people would throw parties used to do, used to be like host and dancers. So I was really convinced at that point, but I really wasn't calling it raving, although Venus did start calling her parties raves, but I don't think that they actually qualified as raves because they always took place at clubs with like established liquor license and stuff like that. So I would say my first real experience raving, I mean, I had caught the bug before I got to this point, and I really understood it. We used to go to, what was that party called? Shade. We used to go to Shade together. That was like early rave experiences for sure, but it was also like, yeah, I wasn't sure if I was like, am I in gay white man space, or am I in like proper rave space? And then finally I ended up at Unter, and I think there was a particular set, and I was like, I'd been out until daybreak before, but for some reason this particular time, I like left when the party ended at like probably 10 a.m. or noon, and I mean, kind of the rest is history. And then Jeff also took me to Berkheim the first time in 2016. Yeah, so Jeff has been like my rave, what do you call it? Guidance?
Jeff
Shaman?
is also my rave godparent.
Oh my God, mentorship program.
Mentorship program. Rave mentorship, yeah.
Oh my gosh, does anyone here know what black market is? Okay, we got some heads. Okay, so very first rave that I went to was in 2012. It was called Black Market, which is not a cool party. It was, but at the time, okay, so this is what I remember. Maybe people can fill in what I don't remember, but at the time, most of the techno parties were happening in Manhattan at Highline Ballroom. And then there was a big scene at the top of the Standard Hotel, but like Brooklyn was not like a thing. And so Black Market was one of the first parties to kind of do the warehouse parties in Brooklyn. And so the first time I went, my friend Maxwell, who was my roommate at the time, invited me. And the lineup was stacked. It was Ben Clock and Ryan Elliott, who were resident DJs at Berkheim. And I didn't really know what that was at the time. But I went and I took ecstasy for the first time, and then I danced so hard that my glasses fell off my face, and I didn't know where they were. And I was like, I'll just go home. Yeah, I have contacts, whatever. I'll just go home without the glasses. And then at the very end of the party, we stayed till close. The lights came on, and at the front of the stage, there were a lot of broken glass, a lot of broken beer bottles, and then my glasses were there, so we found them again. And then I went home that morning, and then I just started writing because I was so inspired, and I was also still high. And this was I was just like, what is this? And I was hooked from then. I just like kept going, and I remember we took the cab home from Black Market with this guy, and he was like, oh my God, there's gonna be a new club in Brooklyn. They're building it from the ground up, and it's going to change everything. I just saw it. It's called Output.
Oh, it did change everything.
It kind of did. I don't know. The jury's out there. So I know, R.I.P. They closed so fast. Anyway, so that's my story.
All right, nice. That's a good segue into a question that I was going to ask at the end, but we'll ask now instead. Why do you think raving makes such a good sort of object of like study, inquiry, and why do you think so many writers love to rave? For anyone.
I think it's really relevant what you just said about leaving the club. I'm still in the habit of calling the club, y'all. The rave in the morning, and then feeling so inspired that you want to write. You're still high, or you're sleep deprived, which is very similar also to being high. And You're just, I think also there's something about, for me, what really attracted me to like dark spaces, rave spaces, club spaces was like, they are places where it's like antisocial inverse. It's like I'm in a room full of people and it's too loud to talk. So it's like I'm here and I'm amongst people, but I can also remain in my head. And even when you're sober, going that long, dancing, sweating, being sleep deprived, being amongst people, observing people, but not speaking, really puts you in a state. I mean, it's like the word trance is like, no, like that's, you know, a very obvious like genre for us, because it's like, yeah, you do go into trance in that space. And it was pivotal for me to like think through some of the like mental like slog and slosh and horribleness that I was sorting through in my early 20s. And like certain revelations just can only happen in that kind of space. I think it's really similar to like some sort of maybe like monastic lifestyle where you're like sleep depriving, you're fasting, and you're, you know, you're doing these things that can get very spiritual very fast, I think.
Yeah, I think also so I've always done my best writing very late at night, like 3, 4, 5 a.m. I procrastinate, and then like the terror sets in right around the time that I know nobody else is paying attention, and then I just like power through into this like trance state. And I think it's like it's the same time that happens, the like time where there is more time, the new time in raving. It's the same time period. There's something about like where your brain goes. But as you asked that, I actually thought of something that is in a different piece in the book that Alice Hines wrote. I'm just gonna read like 2 sentences because I think she like really nails it. Words are the keys to experience. They are also the noisy gatekeepers of experience. I want to throw the key away or snort something off of it. People talk about dissociating. Could I de-articulate? And I think that's what it is. It's like being a writer, like your mental like monologue is incessant. It like turns on as soon as you wake up, and then it like barely shuts up to let you go to sleep. And there's something about being on the dance floor that is like a place where it, for me, doesn't go away completely, but it slows down and it breathes and it relaxes and it becomes less frantic and less anxious and less negative. And like it just like it does that space, whether I'm sober or whether I'm not sober, whatever it is, it just like it lets me exhale and escape from my own brain that is the same brain that produces the writing.
Also good for the mind, all the flashing lights, in my opinion.
Oh.
I think it's like you're a shark or whatever. It stuns you. I don't know. All right, Zoe and Jeff. So when we spoke on, sorry to plug again, the Hellgate podcast. Woo. We also have a podcast. We talked about how it used to be really tough to place any writing about raves, especially in like, or raving, partying in, you know, kind of more mainstream publications. But Zoe, I think you phrased it well. There's been kind of a blossoming of that kind of writing more recently. Why do you think that's changed? And do y'all credit yourselves and writing on raving, which we're going to talk about more after this?
Yes, we do credit ourselves. Not entirely, but.
Yeah, I mean, when we started, it was really hard to publish rave writing. Like, legacy publications did not take it seriously. I think literary culture just didn't really understand rave culture. They didn't really have a Venn diagram. So, you know, we basically, we started the reading series so that we could build community. Like, that's what our medium was. It was community building. And we didn't write for people who were not part of our communities. We wrote for the community. That was our audience. And I think that community just got bigger and bigger. Like we always called it from the beginning a folk art as opposed to a high art. So a high art is like something that a gatekeeper decides is special and then just like sends it off to you and expects you to like it. And then a folk art is like by the community, for the community. It has a specific audience. It's, you know who the audience is. It has a specific purpose. And so I think starting from there, I just think the community got bigger. And also the people, at the very first reading, we had Emily Witt, myself, and Mackenzie Warwick, and we all went on to publish books about raving in one way or another. At the time, those books were not out. And then eventually we got a hit piece in The Quietist that mentioned all three of us as like a problem in the rise of raving and how that like signals the death of the culture. It's obviously not dead because you guys are all here, so.
All right. So I guess to go off of that, you all started writing on Raving in 2021. I'd love to hear about how it evolved from kind of the original concept and how it made it to the, book state. In my mind, I had the book in my hand when I was going to ask that, but which everyone should buy. It was good. I read it. How did it get into the book form we see before us today?
So Jeff sent me a text that was like, we should do a literary reading about raving, and I wanted to say no because I was in a very bad place at the time that included me not being able to write and also hating raves. But the crisis had started at a party and just it was bad. But Jeff had like been extremely supportive of me through it, and he asked me this thing, and I was like, okay, like I should say yes to him. He was like very helpful and like a great friend, and we should do this thing. And so we put it together. I think we thought it was maybe going to be a one-time thing, and then we had it at Nowadays, and like 125 people showed up, and we were like, did you read the flyer? It's a literary reading. There's not supposed to be there's not supposed to be this many people here. But yeah, like Jeff was saying, it's like a community that really needs to be like reflected back to itself. And then Mackenzie, who had read at the first edition, emailed us and was like, hey, look at all these other amazing writer ravers that I know. We should do another one. And we were like, okay, let's do another one. And then Mackenzie sort of joined as like another curator, and then it became another one, and then it was come to San Francisco, come to Los Angeles. Like it just kept growing, and we kept discovering not just that there were more writers who were ravers, but I think importantly, like more ravers who wanted to write, who had never published their writing, who had maybe published it once, but who had these wonderful things to share. And much in the same way we had struggled to place articles about raving in publications, they were struggling to like find an avenue to write what they wanted to write. And so I think that's kind of like how it evolved. And then we'd been doing it for long enough, and like we don't have any documentation, no social media, we don't post any of this anywhere. Very few pieces that have been read at the series have been subsequently published. And we were like, well, we should do a book, right? Like we have all this great writing, like I guess we should do a book. And then Orr, who Mackenzie had a relationship with, came on board and published a book that's like frankly pretty far outside of their usual catalog, but they saw something and we saw something in them, and it's like turned out to be a really wonderful partnership.
Yeah, I have to say, so something we didn't expect was that I think somewhere around half, if not more, contributors had written something for the first time for the reading. And so, as Zoe was saying, because a lot of the stuff wasn't published, we wanted to collect it. And, some of the pieces went through a very intense editing process. One of the contributors, Chris Zaldua, he was in San Francisco during the ghost ship fire, and he remembered, he was planning to go that night, and he got text messages from people saying, don't go. So he ended up losing a lot of friends that night. And, I was following the news story. It got a lot of news. This writer, Michael Chabon, wrote a screenplay about the ghost ship fire. And obviously when the news got out, people were so angry that got killed. But it was like, okay, there are not a lot of narratives about this event from people who are like directly involved. And so, Chris and I worked for a pretty long time and pretty intensely to get together kind of a personal essay about that. And it's the second last piece in the book. And, this kind of like oral history documentation, like, it's not very common, so we wanted to put that out in the world.
I'm going off script again. What do you all find, I guess, most challenging to capture as writers about, the act of raving or, being at a rave in the moment? Because it is this, like, inherently ephemeral thing. I think all of you pretty much touched on this in your pieces. This is not, like, something you can transmit these days. It's also very, like, you're not supposed to record, you're not supposed to capture it, but you are capturing it inherently through writing. So what's tough about that? And what's rewarding?
Well, actually, like, to Jeff's point, it's like the first piece I've written really is in this book. So it's not like I'm like a practice writer on raves. Just like I wrote about Soul Summit, and a lot of times writing comes to me. I mean, I've been writing for a long time, obviously, but I haven't put anything together to publish. And I think a lot of times writing comes to me in sometimes like a very manic sort of state where I'm grieving and I'm restless, and it's like just a lot of things going on. So it's hard for me to answer that question kind of like directly. I think something kind of came up for me where it was like I couldn't rave, and so I wrote about raving, and like the kind of peace and like the tranquility that you find on the dance floor, like post rave. It was something that was like elusive to me at the time, so I wanted to like kind of maybe re-remember it or return to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think with my piece in specifically that's in the book, what I struggled with most was just feeling like up to the task of documenting something that was really profound and important. And Cop City opened last week. The ribbon was cut, and it was, we knew it was coming for months, but it was really devastating. And so I think for me, with the piece, it was more about being able, I felt this like very heavy sense of obligation to like document something well, knowing that it had been portrayed really wrongly in a lot of like the media, and I also thought like really had generally failed to capture like the joy and the fun of being at this thing, and that like Stop Cop City was really fun. Like it was a great week. We had a great time, and like it should be like there should be moments of joy and levity and like struggle. And so I think that was the challenge for me, is when and the only other piece I've ever written about raving, which is not published and probably never will be, was about my dad dying, which led to this like breakdown that luckily did not stop this reading from happening. And it's more just about this like, because for me the rave has been so central to my life that it's like permeated most other experiences I've had in the last 8 years. And so I think for me it's more about like how do I prove that there is this connection between life and rave that is serious and deep and true. And as far as trying to actually capture the rave, like hopefully I did it. I don't know. I think that's the thing, is that we all understand it could never fully be captured.
I've written about raving so much, like so many times. I have to find some new angle every single time I do it. But I think something that I have never been able to capture is the really, really intense intimacy you have with complete strangers. When you close down a party, you're with strangers for 6 hours, and you're seeing this glimpse of them that is purely them, something that maybe their close friends have not even seen before, but you are there and you're with them. And when the party ends, you feel this really crazy feeling with all of the people who were there, and I don't think that can be captured.
And then, so going back to the book a little bit, what do you all feel is kind of the connective tissue between the pieces in the anthology? Because there's poetry, there's a little fiction, there's a lot of essay, there's like some reporting. So what kind of came together as you collected everything?
Probably community and transcendence.
Yeah, I think the connective tissue is that it portrays in its in its variety, the endlessly variant experiences of raving. Yeah.
Sweet. And then getting into kind of the more specific, sorry, easily distracted by sound. So Destiny, you wrote about Soul Summit, which is a party that I assume a lot of people here are familiar with. You know, it's a party founded by Black New Yorkers that plays Black music, house music. And your piece in the anthology kind of focused on it as a case study for party gentrification. Have your thoughts, I guess, how has that evolved in like the last couple of years, you know, so to speak?
In the last couple of years, I wrote the piece, I think it was last year.
Okay.
That was last year. Yeah, it was last year. It was 2023. I started writing it, late 2023. So since then, I mean, what's happening with Soul Summit is something that I mentioned in the piece, where it's like each year the number of parties that they're able to hold in Fort Greene shrinks. But however, on the flip side, they are having way more parties at like different venues. And the parties at the venues is where like you see it in Fort Greene Park as well, but you definitely see it at the venues. It's like it really, I feel like the party really waters down at the venues, and then they like, you know, converge with like Mr. Sunday, which, hopefully I'm not offending anybody here, but yeah, like it's just like a nowadays party where there's like, you know, babies with like headphones. It's like during the day, it just becomes kind of, it feels like, you know, it just feels like an adult Disneyland sometimes, and I feel like that has attracted and sort of advertised Soul Summit to people who are just interested in, or maybe have a lack of interest in like the origins of the music. So I have sort of ended up going to Soul Summit less and less. I think last summer I went maybe like twice or like maybe 1.5 times. I don't go to the venues at all. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
for sure. And I was also curious, something I loved about your piece was kind of getting the overview of your relationship with Jeff, not this Jeff, no offense, who you met at Soul Summit the first time you went, 60s, you know, intergenerational friendship.
Yeah.
Has he read your piece?
He has read the piece.
Nice.
Yeah, he really likes the piece. Jeff is super special. Jeff is a person who, and you all heard a little bit of me getting into it in the piece that I read, but just talking about like the sort of lineage from like disco to house, then to techno. So Jeff was a person that really sort of clarified that for me as a rave elder. And like when I say rave elder, I mean it. Like he was at Paradise Garage. He was he's from Queens, and he started going out when he was 14 years old, and he was born in like the 50s. So he's true to this, you know. Been seen so many cycles, and so he like in all his friends as well. So he like really kind of introduced me to like his friends, and then started taking me to his raves, which the Black uncles and aunties that go to Soul Summit, they have their whole own circuit going on, and they're like kind of like, Soul Summit, yeah, that's cute, whatever, 'cause white people took over, we're over here. So they go to different parties, and so as well as sometimes making an appearance at Soul Summit. So Jeff was introducing me to their raves, and they really do go all night sometimes, but they are getting older, so it's like, you know, it's different. That's kind of like my relationship with Jeff. He also like has a crush on me, so it is hard to really interface with a person who is older, you know, offbeat, you know, party for a long time. You know, it's just like you can't always keep the stability in the relationship without maybe leading somebody on. So that's Jeff. But Jeff is great. We text. He wished me happy birthday. We see each other at Soul Summit. He invites me to stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. And then Destiny and Zoe, both of your pieces, Zoe, the one you just read, have like a distinct current connecting raving and like direct political action. Destiny, you talk about seeing people you'd seen at raves at the George Floyd protests in 2020, and just the shared skills and kind of extreme skepticism of the law and police, mutual aid, spatial and social awareness. Where do you think that similarity ends, I guess? I'm curious about that.
I could talk about this for a really long time, but I think we're running out of time, so I'll keep it tight. I think the similarity, my experience and sort of like what I tried to communicate in this piece is that the longer I raved, the more I realized there is no connection there other than the fact that sometimes people go to both things. However, it's also like not a coincidence that people go to both things. It's like there's something there. There's something that appeals to many different people, and there is a disproportionate number of people who are interested in some sort of like transformative change who go to raves. Like we feel a freedom there that is what we're seeking in our daily lives that the state like denies to us. But it's not gonna happen on its own. It's not inherently political. And it's a funny, I guess when you were asking what is the hard thing to communicate, I think for me it's I still have not figured out the answer to that question, because I guess correlation doesn't equal causation, but there is the correlation.
I think it ends when, well, first of all, I do think it ends when people stop going. It's like if you have a practice of going out and being in tandem with others, and there's a practice to staying in the network, discretion, boundaries, space, respect, drug administration, all these things. It's those kind of practices, they do lend themselves to this other thing, where if you then kind of become, maybe say you become completely domestic, and you have your work life and you have your home life, and there is no sort of sociality schema at all in your life, I do feel like that's when the populace sorts of begins to lose the muscle to then be in spaces with other people for other maybe more intentional kinds of action and behavior and organization and attentiveness to other people and other people's bodies. I feel like we have the phones in our hands all the time, and I think the sort of fracturing that's happening, the fragmenting that's happening is all the more prevalent. I feel like rave space is kind of like an antidote to that. So I think as long as people are going, it's not necessarily that you're inherently getting people who are going to organize, and they are meeting at the club, and then they form this block, and then they go on the street, and they go to the protest or whatever. I think it's more so just remaining in connection with people and being in that sort of undercurrent, and making sure you always have a connection there. I will say in 2020, not to ramble too much, but I got involved with some organizing that just put the sound in the streets. So it was all the audio production people that were producing raves and clubs came together and was what do we do? And I just kind of ended up helping them organize to bring sound systems into the street. And it's those kind of connections were already made tangible because I had been in rave space with these people. And it's I wouldn't know a sound organizer, and the guy that people love to complain about, the sound guy, that didn't know somebody who had the organizing capability or the wherewithal to put it all together, to help put it together. So it was important for us to be in community.
All right, sweet. Thanks, everyone. This was fun.
Thanks for coming. please have a drink, pick up a Hellgate tote, pick up a book if you didn't already, and we're just gonna play some music and hang out for a little bit. And yeah, thanks for coming by.